What is the Leader of the Opposition doing, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
What am I doing? I'm standing in the House of Commons. Where is he? Where's Waldo, Mr. Speaker?
Today, Mark Carney and Danielle Smith dropped a historic energy pact, a deal that could shape Alberta's entire future and Canada's entire economy, so big that it basically tears up a decade of liberal climate policy in one morning. But while everybody is staring at the shiny new pipeline potential, the government is doing something else very, very quietly. Because at the exact same time, they're pushing a new hate speech bill and rolling out committee testimony claiming that young men, yes, boys, are being radicalized and must be silenced. I'm Jasmine Lane. Subscribe, like, follow, and comment your thoughts down below. Share this video as well. I don't know how nobody is calling out the hypocrisy of this one, because I guess if you can't beat Trump, you should just copy him, right?
The Canadian steel and lumber industries will always be at the heart of Canada's competitiveness, our security, and our strength.
By and large, are not products that we are consuming. There's some element of that, but by and large, you know, a steel company, how much steel are you using these days, Todd? I mean, not as much we used. So anyway, so that's core.
It is really something to see how quickly people move when something becomes politically convenient for them. Mark Carney and the Liberals made a big grand announcement the other day, and we're going to pick it apart, but let's just listen to it first.
We'll impose a global 25% tariff on targeted imported steel derivative products, such as wind towers, prefabricated buildings, fasteners, and wires, to grow demand for Canadian-made steel. Those products as a whole represent about a $10 billion market.
Do you remember just a few short months ago when Mark Carney's entire economic pitch was basically Trump tariffs will destroy Canada, but tariffs hurt the American economy more than they do Canadians, but it's still going to really destroy us? Like, does anybody have a memory at all? Does anybody listen to themselves while they speak anymore? Because the core contradiction here, literally, they still talk about this, about how tariffs are dangerous, they're populist, they're economically reckless and illiterate, they're bad for consumers, anti-trade, destabilizing, when Trump used them.
Let me start with limiting foreign steel imports to ensure that our steel producers have a bigger share of our market. Doing so will unlock hundreds of millions of dollars in domestic demand for those producers. We will reduce tariff-free steel imports from non-free trade area partners from 50% of 2024 levels, as it is today, to 20% of those levels. This will open up more than $850 million in new domestic demand for Canadian steel. In order to build on that, I'm announcing today that we will make it more affordable to transport Canadian steel and lumber across this country by cutting freight rates for transporting steel and lumber interprovincially by 50%.
But now, all of a sudden, they're magically strategic. You know, they're protective, they're pro-Canadian, pro-worker, visionary, necessary. It's almost as though they were never against tariffs, which have been used historically across all nations. They were actually just against Trump. And Canada's political class and their electorate hated the messenger, not the policy, because otherwise there's no way they would be celebrating it now, is there? But you hated the policy because your messenger, i.e. the Liberal government, had put you in a very weak, vulnerable situation due to their policy, which is the real policy that you should hate, by the way, if that made any sense to you.
We're seeing today, again, the cost of Carney's broken promises. He promised he'd negotiate a win with President Trump with a deal by July 21st. No deal, no win, no elbows, no job. And now the Prime Minister is spending billions more to bail himself out for breaking his trade promises and for raising industrial carbon taxes on those very industries we most need to save. Conservatives believe in our workers. We want to protect steel, aluminum, lumber, and other sectors. We want to negotiate a hard bargain to protect them and get them re-entry into the American market tariff-free. And we also intend to get rid of the entire industrial carbon tax so that we can make steel, aluminum, autos, and other products with the lowest taxes and the best growth in workers' wages. That's the way that you serve the national interest and the workers of our country.
And that right there is the nail on the head that the Liberal government they know it exists. Like, they know that it does, but they will not back down on what hasn't worked and just continuing to use it anyway. I mean, as an example, from 2017 till 2024, which is when I was able to pull data from, the US had the most attractive investment environment in the G7. I'm very curious to see how that plays out when new reports from 2025 come out. But they had some really big corporate tax cuts. They went from 35% to 21%, which is pretty significant. They had tons of rollbacks and reform when it came to permitting, regulations, cheap energy. That was a really big one. And dare I bring into the equation the fact that, by all accounts, Canada has not had a national economic strategy for a decade, at least. You know, the US, in comparison, is laser focused on reshoring manufacturing, being an absolute dominator when it comes to artificial intelligence. When Canada said no to LNG, the US said, "You're an idiot." Okay, and started building all of this stuff for LNG. They're very good, really focused on attracting capital, on attracting or on building export capacity, whereas Canada has been laser focused on DEI bureaucracy, social justice, social causes, climate compliance paperwork, all these things that in the grand scheme don't really matter. You know, like what tangible evidence and data is there from a accredited source that's trustworthy to show us that focusing on these environmental causes, that focusing on all of that stuff has benefited our society? What is there? I would love to see it, and I would be happy to issue an apology if I am proven wrong. On that note, actually, I was on the Numbeo Quality of Life Index, and I wrote this out, so I'll just show you my screen here. But the climate index for your quality of life, how things have improved or done the polar opposite, it showed that in 2016, which is when they started counting climate as an example, Canada was ranked at 43. And by 2025, Canada was ranked number 80. So that's after 10 years of all of this environmental stuff. And we dropped hard. So explain that to me.
But I think part of the debate that needs to play out here over the coming weeks and months to actually get this thing built is to actually educate the public on the state of modern engineering, how tanker traffic actually works, and all the safety precautions that are in place so that oil spills don't happen, and the kind of like worst of ducts covered with oil like you saw in movies in the 90s is just frankly not a reality today because of modern engineering, and the men and women who work in the industry are able to do it. And I think you're going to see that debate take out, and I think part of what you're going to have to see for that to be successful is to have less of the name calling that you saw in the past, where radical this and radical that, and kind of like two people never talking to each other, and actually work on convincing skeptics. The ardent opponents who are going to be radically opposed to this, they're not ultimately the audience, because you know they're going to be against it no matter what. They've shown themselves to be against all development in this country for a very long time. But for people who are skeptical, and for people who also have concerns about climate, especially in that Liberal voting coalition, to speak to them directly to say, here's how we're mitigating the climate piece, here's how we're actually going to be able to this built, and here's all the environmental protections that are in place thanks to the ingenuity of technology and Canadian men and women working in the industry.
So just a few hours ago, Premier Danielle Smith and Prime Minister Mark Carney sat down and they signed a historic energy MOU. When you look a little bit closer at it, though, you know, the agreement itself is politically volatile. It's economically contradictory to some degree, and structurally absolutely impossible without huge fights from British Columbia environmental people and also Carney's own caucus. So let's break down kind of what is all inside of this. One thing to make very, very clear is that the agreement promises this will not go ahead unless there is a privately financed Indigenous co-owned pipeline with 1 million barrels per day to the West Coast, with the tanker ban amended or suspended, and BC consulted after the fact. also known as Blindsided.
I have repeatedly stated how critical it is to reform a broken regulatory environment that is scaring away investment and demoralizing our energy entrepreneurs here at home. And I have asked repeatedly for the federal government to cease their attempts to throttle our energy industry, repeal or overhaul their 9 bad laws, and work with Alberta to grow our energy sector for the benefit of the entire country. And today's agreement is the first step in accomplishing all of these critical objectives and unleashing the power and promise of Alberta's energy sector in a way never seen before in this country.
There's a lot of key parts to this, and essentially it sounds like Alberta would get everything that they wanted, but again, with that safety net of all of the people who are going to be able to make it stop.
Anis Hidari, CBC. Prime Minister, are you willing to approve a pipeline even if British Columbia or affected First Nations don't agree? Would you compensate them instead?
Well, just to be clear, this agreement today between Alberta and the Government of Canada, it's the first step. It's an example of cooperative federalism. We're agreeing in partnership and in a spirit of trust. But what has to happen, several things have to happen before a pipeline is built. And one of those is a private sector proponent. Secondly, goes directly to your question, which is that there needs to be full partnership, including equity ownership, substantial economic benefits with First Nations in Alberta, First Nations in British Columbia, as well as agreement and substantial economic benefits for the people of British Columbia. So we look at this as the start of a process. We've created some of the necessary conditions for this to happen.
This is certainly the first time in the last at least 50 years that anything like this has happened between a federal Liberal government and the province of Alberta regarding pipelines. So that's all very accurate. And, you know, I do want to caution, because there's a lot of people who I've seen that are like, oh, Danielle Smith, she fell for Mark Carney's trap. This is never going to happen, blah, blah, blah. I'm not really of that belief at all. We just talked to Danielle Smith a couple days ago on the show. If you want to look back in videos and watch it, you can if you haven't seen it yet. But I think that Danielle Smith is a very smart woman, and I think that she is also playing the game. And I think that she is genuinely going to give the Carney government every opportunity to show that he is different. And if he's not, her reaction to that will be very telling. The world of politics is all about strategy, right? And at the end of the day, yes, this is absolutely a good starting point. Will it follow through? That is the true question. And Danielle Smith being open to the starting point, there's no reason to shame her for any of that as far as I can tell. Not rationally, at least. Yes, this is a very heated topic. There's a lot of anger around it, but everybody's playing a game here, and we're just going to have to see who actually wins the battle, right?
This agreement means the end of the punitive oil and gas emissions cap so that our great energy producers can grow and thrive again. This agreement means the immediate suspension of the federal net zero power regulations in Alberta, which had placed our electrical grid at a very serious risk of failure and limited any hope of substantial investment in AI data centers and applications development. This agreement includes a clear path to the construction of an over 1 million barrel per day Indigenous co-owned bitumen pipeline to Asian markets so that our province and our country are no longer dependent on just one customer to buy our most valuable resource. This agreement also allows for needed adjustments to the tanker ban when the new pipeline to Asia is approved by the Major Projects Office, as well as amendments that will ensure our companies are able to advertise their environmental leadership and efforts throughout the world without a fear of penalty.
I would also argue that the agreement that was signed today is truly, like, what a success story that is, to have the Prime Minister of the Liberal government sign on paper and in essence agree that all of these policies are hurting us. And while they're not ready to repeal them full throttle, the acknowledgement is there. And that alone is such a big win. And who knows what that will end up turning into going forward if there's more provinces or more businesses who say, look, you have acknowledged the harm you're causing our economy, our industries, our jobs. You've acknowledged it. Now what? What are you going to do about it? So I think there will be some interesting politics to see play out here. And I did want to share with you Pierre Poilievre. He wrote, Conservatives would approve a pipeline to the Pacific without a carbon tax, without delay, without excuses, period. Conservatives want stronger take-home pay and a self-reliant economy for Canadians. Unblocking our oil and gas will boost paychecks and the Canadian dollar so Canadians get more of their money and life becomes affordable. More oil and gas revenues means more money for schools, hospitals, building affordable homes, and lowering the cost of food. We need a pipeline to the Pacific to get world prices for our product and limit our reliance on a single market. Unfortunately, Prime Minister Mark Carney stands in the way of it all. With federal rules and taxes that drive production out, paychecks down, and the cost of living out. Today's memorandum does not promise a pipeline will be built. It promises that 7 months from now, a pipeline proposal will be referred to the federal office for 2 further years of study. After that, the Prime Minister will award British Columbia's NDP Premier the power to veto altogether, a veto that violates the Constitution. That one, mostly true, but also putting a lot of the blame on the BC NDP Premier rather than including First Nations groups in there, environmental activists, all that stuff. But yes, it is factually correct that British Columbia could very well stall this for years if they wanted to. This from a prime minister who promised during the election to move with unimaginable speed. The deal further proposes raising the Liberal industrial carbon tax that will drive production out, paychecks down, and the cost of living up. We are happy to see that the Alberta Premier forced the Prime Minister to flip-flop on some of his other costly environmental policies that he supported up until a few weeks ago, but the deal does not bring a new pipeline to the Pacific. It brings higher taxes, long delays, and more dependence on the United States. And then it goes on in here just to kind of emphasize how much the Liberal government needs to get out of the way and how this obviously isn't doing that, right? Especially when you think about Bill C-5 passing, that gives the Prime Minister authority to approve these projects, including by going around regulations and laws. So the fact that that still hasn't happened, I think, is pretty showing of what is maybe to come. Because no matter which way it goes, we're going to learn a lot from this. And it's going to either be really wonderful or catastrophically horrendous for the Carney Liberal government. This also just makes me reflect as well. When it came to Bill C-5 passing, there was a lot of people who were really mad at the Conservatives for letting that pass. And to that, I say, this is exactly why. Again, it's strategy. It's the long-term strategy that, yes, it sucks in the short term sometimes, but the long-term strategy here is absolutely genius of proving to that voter base that they are no different. They are not going to do anything differently at all. And Sean Fraser is honestly just the perfect example of that one.
There is a gap that has been left after the Senville decision. We're going to fill that gap, and we're going to do it very quickly.
Child abusers are heinous criminals and should be treated as such by Canada's criminal laws. We will be moving forward with legislative solutions.
And legislation that I will be tabling before this House rises over the Christmas holidays to offer additional protections for children who are being exploited online.
And a third bill before Christmas regarding intimate partner violence, sexual offenses, and the role of victims in this process.
Yes, he's urging unity on combating hate. And, it really is just sickening to me how frequently it is that inside of these bills, the Liberals, man, did they ever do a good job of hiding things inside of these bills. And then by doing that, they're able to shift the national conversation to a moral issue where they can play hero and paint Conservatives as anti-women, anti-child safety, anti-safety for all, anti-against bullying, if they raise any concerns to what is actually inside of these bills that they're trying to push through. And they bank on the fact that most people will never actually go through them. Fair enough, because they're usually very long. But I mean, look at this one. From City News, it says, Justice Minister suggests new bill could address coercive control in relationships. The thing about that's fascinating is in theory, Sean Fraser wants to introduce a law that is almost impossible to enforce in practice because only 3.7% of coercive control cases result in a charge, largely because victims may recant, police lack training, judges don't understand it, and there's no physical evidence. So a justice system who already can't prosecute violent offenders, sexual assaults, repeat offenders, bail violations, shoplifting, gun crime, their natural solution, as per usual, is let's just add another offense. And, well, even this one, because it's going to sound really good in the headlines, it's going to require advanced psychological evidence and perfect victim cooperation, which rarely happens in these cases. And that's going to make this bill sell. And if that doesn't work, well, hey, the kids are behind us at least. Yeah, we're gonna get some kids your nephew, tell him to come up on stage and talk about being bullied online and how this new legislation is going to fix that, because the legislation that isn't currently enforced isn't being enforced, but this new one will be. Alrighty then. It's really irritating to me because liberals love vague language. Hate speech, it became harmful content. Disinformation became online harms. And now coercive control, as vaguely as it is defined. Honestly, when governments push very vague laws, they almost always use them in ways that it was never initially intended for. So coercive control, in this case, it's for people in abusive relationships. Well, that could also, because it's written so vaguely, that could also refer to online messages. That could refer to political conversations, behavior on social media. If you think that's far-fetched, dare I say Bill C-63, which the Liberals still want to bring forth, where they tried to regulate harmful content, potentially hurtful content, and content that undermines national unity. So all of this really does fit their pattern. And if you think that I'm being a little bit irrational or a conspiracy theorist over coming to this conclusion, dare I show you the committee testimony.
You state that it's, and I quote, alarming to see the growing impact of the manosphere and how they are conditioning vulnerable populations such as teens, particularly young men. What patterns are you seeing in how algorithmic content and influencer culture are shaping early attitudes towards gender, and what makes these online narratives so effective at pulling vulnerable young men into misogynistic worldviews?
Thank you for that question. Young boys and young men are looking to the internet, turning to the internet for connection, to learn about dating, to learn about what it means to be a young man, and looking for social supports, and looking to figure themselves out. And as they do these searches, they are presented with these deeply misogynistic and hateful videos and resources put out by these social influencers. We are seeing more and more of that kind of impact, and these young men start to take on those narratives. They start to accept those ideologies, those ways, those narratives, those advices that are often disguised as improving, improving self-esteem, improving their own looks and physique, and so forth, but often incorporating deeply hateful, misogynistic attitudes, blaming women, blaming immigrants and newcomer communities for all the problems that men, boys, and young men are experiencing today. That more and more young people are falling prey to those types of narratives in the absence of good, positive role models, influencers that talk about what it means to be to shed those harmful gender stereotypes and social norms that so many young men are pressured to live with and grow up believing in. We need to change that around. We need to quiet those hateful voices, misogynistic voices, and instead present good role model voices, influencers who can share supportive, allied narratives that young men can take on.
It's kind of funny that he mentions that, because there actually is somebody, a conservative even, who is doing exactly what he says needs to be done. And you will not believe the way in which they speak about that individual. That is coming up on tomorrow's episode. And I will be bringing all of the receipts, because I'm pretty tired of the lies, the hypocrisy, the gaslighting, and this weird moral superiority of we're the good guys while they do all the things bad guys do, and they do all the things that they accuse everybody else of doing. It's this crazy dichotomy here in Canada. I'm Jasmine Lane. Like, share, subscribe, comment your thoughts down below. And as always, share this video and stay tuned because tomorrow is going to be a very, very good one.